Now the next part of my spreadsheet that I want to show you is analysis that I have done for myself. So the data I have opened up for you is the death counts for these vaccine categories between January 22 and May 2022. And you will see here the total for the period for unvaccinated persons dying is some 7,462 persons. And the total for anyone who ever had a vaccination, their death count is 170,771 persons. These are all sad deaths. Every death is an individual, and my heartfelt condolences go to all people who are part of these statistics. But we can see here the ratio of the death levels to the overall total. So if you were unvaccinated, the death ratio is 4.2% of the total, and the ever vaccinated ratio is 95.8% of the total. Now I'll open up this section of my spreadsheet to show you the additional analysis that I have added, which I believe is relevant. So having determined what our count of deaths are across the different vaccine categories, I have then brought in the population sizes for each of these categories. Firstly, you will see here that I'm using a total population, and this is a population representing over 12s of some 54.4 million. Now, if you saw my previous video, I detail how I arrive at this figure, and I will stress that the government themselves use a slightly lower figure of 48 million. But looking at that spreadsheet where I show this data, the reason I use 54.4 million in my analysis here is that in the England we have some 62 million persons registered with a general practitioner. That means we have 62.2 million within the government's data set within England for statistical analysis and for being permitted to participate in the vaccine rollout program. So I use a figure of 62.2 million. I take off the under 12 population in England, which I got from another ONS database, and that is how I arrive at my figure of 54.4 million. The other important data from this table that I need to share with you is that because we know the numbers vaccinated for first jab, second jab, third jab, we also know the numbers who only specifically had one jab. The numbers, these would be this number, which is the difference between 45.4 million and 42.8 million here. That's a figure of 2.5 million. And then between second jab and third jab, the differential there is 9 million odd people. Going back to my other table, you will see I have these figures inserted here. The 2.5 million who only had one jab only and didn't have any further jabs. The 9 million who had two jabs but didn't have a third jab. And then the total of 33 million who were the people who came forward for all three of the vaccine jabs in the year of 2021. Now, I mentioned the statistics of death ratios, and we now see here that the unvaccinated population represent 16.6% of this population of 54.4 million, and the vaccinated represented a population size of 83.4%. Now clearly the unvaccinated death rates, which amount to 4.2% of the total in the period January to May 2022, is much lower than the actual population of unvaccinated people being 16.6%. So that immediately indicated to me that perhaps the government's official metrics for reporting this data was giving erroneous and not quite correct information. Looking further, we see that the population of unvaccinated persons, some 9 million, their death ratio for the period January to May 2022 against the population size, so this is 7,462 over the population size of 9 million, that equals a ratio of 0.08%. Now this compares with the second population set, which is first dose, and that has a ratio of 0.09%. So unvaccinated to first dose, the ratios are very, very similar. Going to the second dose of vaccine, however, we see a jump in the ratio to 0.21, which is more than twice the ratio of the unvaccinated persons. And then finally, when we go to the third dose, we see that the ratio of deaths to that population size is equal to 0.44%, and this is some 5 times greater than the unvaccinated ratio. So I have produced a table for these factors. So first dose only, the ratio of deaths to unvaccinated is 1.1. For 2 doses, the ratio is 2.5, and for 3 doses, it is 5.36. Now, the thing to therefore observe here, that these ratios are diametrically the opposite of the ONS statistics and metrics given, which indicated that overall unvaccinated people were dying at a higher ratio than vaccinated, at a ratio of some 1.32. And for overall, in my table, the overall ratio for vaccinated deaths to unvaccinated deaths is 4.55. So I have tried to present this data in a very logical manner. I've been a financial analyst of many, many years. I'm used to dealing with large data sets and complex issues. If you ask me to give an analysis, this is how I would go about it. Now, if we also show you the additional figures for not just January to May 2022, but the quarter, March to May, we see that the ratios have actually got worse. And if we look at the May only period, then we see they have got worse again. So what it looks like is that those who are vaccinated, their death ratio is increasing relative to unvaccinated persons. Now, I have to make an important qualifier here, because it's not my wish to provide a data set that seems alarming, particularly to the large proportion of the population who have had a vaccine. It's not my wish to do that at all. So the issue that we need to be considering is, are there specific aspects to the unvaccinated population that would mean that they would be dying at a different level and a lower level to vaccinated persons? For example, most people in the country who die tend to be over 60 or 65 years of age. Therefore, if the majority of the vaccinated population that I have here are under 65 years of age, then there could be good statistical reasons why their death ratios would be lower than for vaccinated people, who are just naturally an older range of people and therefore at a higher propensity and likelihood of dying. However, the point I want to stress from this analysis is actually the fact that the BBC in their article made an assertion that the data supported facts that unvaccinated people were actually dying at a higher ratio than vaccinated people. And this assertion is clearly preposterous. Also preposterous given for the period January to March, total unvaccinated persons who have died are only 7,400 odd people, against a total for ever vaccinated persons of 170,000 odd persons. So an article made by the BBC is clearly factually incorrect. And I just call on agencies run by the government, the Office of National Statistics, to look into these data calculations and perhaps reassess how they should be measuring the death ratios to determine what is the true picture on this. So going back to the BBC article, just to summarize, the article actually says, while this data on its own can't tell us it's the vaccine protecting people from dying, there are too many complicating factors, which I agree. If vaccines were driving excess deaths, we would expect this to be the other way round. Well, I think my analysis clearly indicates that vaccine deaths are clearly higher than unvaccinated deaths, and therefore we should have an inquiry with most urgency to look into this. So I want to conclude this video with just some questions that I think my analysis poses. Please pause the video to read these questions in detail. But I hope you find this interesting. I don't want to be an alarmist, but I believe the analysis clearly shows there are issues around increased deaths if you have had certainly 3 vaccines, and I call on the government to look into this. So please show this video perhaps to your GP and your MP and ask them to assess it for rationality and to see whether they will agree with it, and call on the government, like others are doing, to perhaps take a pause on the vaccine rollout until the higher death ratios that we are seeing at the minute are properly understood. So thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.